Hey everyone, in this screencast, I'm going to talk a little bit about the box model. The box model is something that allows us to actually create layouts using CSS. So far with CSS, all we've really been doing is using it to format text. So now we're going to learn about the box model and figure out how to use it to create actual layouts. So for example, like multiple columns, separate sections with different backgrounds, background colors, background images, different sections separated by borders. And the box model also allows us to create spacing between elements. So for example, in looking at my course site, we've got these separate sections. You've got your header up here, the navigation section with the purple background. So of course, each of those have different background colors. And there's also additional spacing above, below, and on the sides that we're able to use to achieve because of the box model. In this example also, in our main content area, the part on the left is pretty typical. It's what we're used to. We just have text going from top to bottom down the screen, but we have this little sidebar section here, which is only possible through the box model, because the box model is what enables us to create multi-column layouts. So just to do a quick run through here. So of course you're used to the course site. This is what it looks like with CSS. I'm in Safari right now, and I'm going to go under develop to disable styles to turn off the CSS. And of course, this is what we have without any CSS at all. So we can see, obviously no text formatting. And the other thing is we don't have any of those box model styles. So no spacing, no background colors, no columns. I'm going to give you a couple other quick examples here. So here's a client site that I maintain. It looks like there's an issue actually. So you've got your basic header area up here with the logo and the navigation, big hero section, and then some information about the company. Again, multi-column, 3-column layout. None of this is possible with just basic HTML. It's all possible through CSS, and specifically through this box model thing that I'm going to talk about in a second. Okay. So the idea with the box model is every element, so everything that you write as HTML, so every tag or every element, remember those two words are interchangeable. Every element is essentially considered a box. And that box contains the content. So for example, if we have an H1, let me go over to my example here. So this H1, the H1 tag surrounds the content. The H1 tag acts as a box around that content. So this is going to apply to all tags, so all block level and all inline tags. They all are boxes containing the content. There are some differences, of course, with block level and inline, which I'll get into in a little more detail. But generally speaking, every element is essentially a box that contains the content. Every box or every element has certain properties that we can control through this box model. So this little visual here, it is linked from my course site. This little visual gives us an overview of the different features of the box model, or the different things that we're going to be able to target and modify. So first of all, the dark red, that essentially represents our content. So like in this H1 example, the literal word header here, that's what would show up in this red area. Directly outside the content, we then have padding on the top, sides, and the bottom. Directly outside the padding, we then have a border that we can also control, all sides. We can also target individual sides as well. Outside the border, we then have the margin. So we have content, padding, border, margin. In addition, through the box model, we are also able to target the width property and the height property to set both the width and the height of an element. Of course, keep in mind that most elements, the width and more specifically the height is typically controlled by the content. So like however tall the content is, that will control the height typically, but you still can control the width, like the maximum width that you would want an element to take up. So this visual gives us an overview of the box model. So again, the basic concept is that every element is contained inside of a box. The box model says that we can target those elements and manipulate the width, the height, the padding, meaning the space between the content itself and its edge. That edge is the border. And then the space outside the border would be the margin. So outside the border on the sides and the top and bottom between elements. So let's go ahead and see what this actually looks like. So I have this HTML file here. I've zoomed in a little bit. Let me do some more just so it's easier to see. So I have an HTML file here that has a few different sections. So one thing you'll notice here in this example is that I've got just a bunch of placeholder content. We're used to that, but I've divided, and note that word, divided. I've divided all of my content into separate sections. And I've literally used the div or the division tag to do that. So this is something that you're going to want to get in the habit of. This is when we start creating layouts with HTML and CSS, it's important to put your content in there, figure out how you want that content to look, and then rearrange all of those content into separate sections so that you can then target those sections and specify background colors, widths, borders, and all the stuff we're going to go through in a moment. So in this example, I have separated out my header into its own div. I've separated out what I'm calling my content into a separate div. You'll notice that this has multiple pieces. I've got a subheader, I've got a list, and I've actually got even another nested div. And then all the way at the bottom, I've got a footer. So separating out my content into these individual divs, and so that's number one. The second thing, and giving those divs an ID. Note, I'm using an ID, not a class. Giving these an ID because they're unique sections in the page. Doing this is going to give me more flexibility to style those sections separately. If I don't separate them, that means if they're all in one section, and then I give that section a background color, that means everything in there is going to have that same background color. So I separate them out so that I have more control over all of the styling. Not just text formatting, but all of this box model stuff that we're talking about now. Okay, so here's my basic structure, my starting point with my HTML. This is what it looks like over here. I haven't applied any CSS yet. I'm going to go ahead and do a couple quick examples of the box model. So I'm going to target the header. So remember, I'm targeting the block or the box that is containing my header. I've put my header in an H1 tag, so I could target the H1 tag, but again, to give me more flexibility, I'm just going to go ahead and wrap that content inside of a separate div, and on that div, I'm giving it its own ID And now up here, I'm going to target that ID. So you use an ID, I use the ID attribute on the tag that I'm assigning it to. To target it with CSS, I use hashtag and then the name of the ID. So let's see, the first thing I'm going to do here is show you the border property. I'm just going to type this out real quick and show you. So the border property, so you can see as soon as I added this property called border, I'll go through these values in a moment, I now have a border around my content. One thing, you'll notice that the content within my H1 is sort of smushed up against the edge there, so that's something we're going to target in a moment. So that's padding, the space between the content and the edge, which is the border. And then outside of that edge is going to be the margin. But going back to the border property, with borders, so this is a little bit different than what we're going to see with padding and margin. With borders, you'll see that there are actually 3 different values that you need to specify. So borders can have a width, a style, and a color. The width is going to be, I could make this 20 pixels. You do need to put in the unit size though. So this is whatever size you want that to be. There are predefined styles. If you look in the notes for today for the box model, you'll see all the different ones. There's like solid, double, dashed, dotted, stuff like that. So there's not that many, like a handful of different styles. And then color. So this is, let me do the full one here. So this is where you're going to put in your hexadecimal value, or as I've talked about before, if you have the RGB values, you can put that in there instead. RGB would look something like this. RGB and then your red, green, and blue values. Okay, so I changed the width, so you can see much bigger. The other thing with border, which we're also going to see with margin and padding, by the way, is that you can say border, like I just did, and then give your values, and you'll notice it applies to all 4 sides. You can also be specific. So I could say border top, or actually let me do border bottom. That makes a little more layout sense. So now I've only targeted, remember, just on this one div that contains this H1, saying on that div, set a bottom border to 20 pixels high, black, and solid style. Okay, let me set this back to a full border. So as I said before, you can see that there's not much room here between the content and the border itself. So this is where padding is going to come into play. So I'm going to just do an arbitrary number here, 20 pixels. And you can see that I now have more space between the content and the edge or the border. Okay, I'm going to bring up the inspector here just to give us a little more visual cues here. So when I bring this up in the inspector and I hover over my div, the div that contains that H1, you can see that I've got those different colors. So in this case, if we think about that visualization we looked at a few minutes ago, and the inspector shows my content as the blue part that's highlighted. So my content, the actual words, is taking up that amount of space. And remember, the divs are block level elements, so that's why it's going all the way across the page by default. So the blue is my content, the green is the padding, and then that sort of orangey whatever color is the border. Just like with border, you can specify an individual, so I'm using a text editor here that gives me some clues as I type. So you can say padding, which is automatically going to be all four sides, or you can just target an individual side if you want. The other thing with padding and with margin actually, and border, is you can still use the padding, just the word padding, the shortcut. So that's basically going to say, all four sides. So if you give only one value here, it's going to apply that value to all four sides. You can also use, let's see, the padding shortcut and give it 4 different values if you wanted to have 4 different values on all 4 sides. The way this works is it starts at the top and it goes clockwise. So 20 pixels is going to be the top padding. Whoops. 10 pixels will be the right, 4 is going to be bottom, 8 is going to be the left. So you can see there's a little bit of a difference there now when I look at the padding in the inspector. There are also some other shortcuts, and this is all in the notes in case this doesn't quite stick as you're listening. So you can do in one go different values for all 4 sides, or if you wanted, and I do this a lot, I sometimes have a different value I want to give to the top and the bottom, and then a separate value for the sides. In that case, you can just pass 2 values. When you pass 2 values, it assumes that the first one is going to be top and bottom, and the second one right and left. Actually, let me make this a little more dramatic. So now I've got 60 pixels top and bottom for padding, meaning the space between the content and the border. And then I think it was 10 pixels for the sides. Okay, and then we also have, I'm going to space this out a little better so it's easier to see. We also have margin. Margin is the same as padding in that it can accept up to 4 values. So you can say margin, and that'll be all 4 sides, or you can say margin bottom, margin left, margin right, margin top. You can also say, use the margin shortcut and give 4 different values or 2 different values like I just did with padding. So same rule applies for both padding and margin. So when I add margin 20 pixels, so I just did 1 value, so it assumes all 4 sides. So I now have space between the border and the outside of the element or the outside of the box. So now when I look at this in the inspector, blue is the content, green is the padding, that orangey color, or mustardy color I guess, is the border, and then that orange color on the outside is the margin. So that's the space outside the element. So I could say, let's do 60 pixels for top and bottom, 20 for the sides. So you can see that puts a lot of space on the top and bottom. So between whatever content comes before and after, and then just a little bit of space on the sides. Okay, so that's border, padding, and margin. Keep in mind that all 3 of those have 4 sides. You can target a side individually, or you can target, or you can define all 4 at once, either with the same value or 4 different values for all 4 sides. The other thing with Box Model is width. We can use width to, so remember block level elements will take up the full width of its parent element by default. We can override that using the width property, the width CSS property. So in this case, I'm saying set the width of this div to 80%. When you use a relative unit, you always need to be a little careful, because what this is saying is it's going to be 80% of whatever its parent element is. In this case, the parent element is the body or the whole browser window. So it's going to be 80%, it's going to take up 80% of the entire browser window. You can also use pixel values. So let's say 400 pixels. And this, of course, is never going to change. That's a fixed width. So no matter how big or how small the window gets, it's going to be 400 pixels. So actually, let me make this 800. So you can see, in this case, when I make the browser window really small, it actually goes off the screen. Something to keep in mind, it's generally a good idea to use relative sizing for widths when possible. We are going to talk a little bit about responsive design in the last 2 weeks of the semester, meaning how to adjust for different device sizes like mobile, tablets, etc. So that's width. You can also set height. Height, though, is a little trickier because, so you'll see that I set height to 100 pixels. It did actually change a little bit, but typically you're going to want to let the content within the element or within the box determine the height. There are, of course, exceptions, but typically you want to default to that, and then only use height when you need maybe like your header or your navigation to never get higher than a certain amount. You just need to be careful, because sometimes different users might have their default browser font size set really high, which can, break your layout in certain ways if you're relying on very specific heights for your elements. Okay, last thing here is background. So why don't I target something else here? I'm going to target my content div. So this whole thing right here, which if we look over here is going to be this subheader, this list, and this paragraph. So I'm going to target the content div and therefore everything inside of it, everything nested inside of it, and I'm going to give it a background. So using the background CSS property. The background CSS property, you can give it a color, which is what I'm going to do here. You can also give it a path to an image. I'm going to have a separate screencast about that because that's can get a little more complicated. So really simply though, I'm just going to give this a gray color background. Pretty straightforward. And again, you can see as soon as I do that, you'll notice that the content smushes right up against the edge or the border by default. So this is, a good candidate to add a little padding here, meaning the space between the content and its edge. So that gives a little breathing room. And now I'm going to target this div. It's nested within this content, but I'm going to target just that div and give it a separate background color. Again, I don't expect anyone to memorize these hexadecimal values. These are just ones that I know off the top of my head because I use them a lot for testing. So you can see that I've now targeted, so everything in the content has a gray background color, and then I've targeted this div, or this paragraph within it, and I'm giving that a separate background color. And of course I can give it some padding too. So not a very pretty to look at layout, but should at least give you a general sense of what these different box model properties do. So again, the box model is what allows us to create layouts using CSS. Every element, every piece of content is contained inside of a tag. Every tag is essentially a box. So every tag has the ability to have a width, a height. You can set its background color. You can modify its padding, meaning the space between the content and its edge. You can modify its border if you want. And then you can also adjust the space outside of that box. So between the box and whatever content is next to it or above or below it. And that would be the margin. So yeah, so I think that's it. So that's the box model. For the next couple weeks, I mean, really for the rest of the semester, this is essentially what we're going to be focusing on. We're going to be getting into more specific, more complicated layouts. All of them use the box model. So it's really important to understand at least what this is and to get very familiar with how to control borders, padding, margin, backgrounds, and then also width and height. I'm going to have another follow-up screencast where I go through the lab step by step, and another one where I go into more detail with the background CSS property. You saw me use it here with colors, just solid colors. I'll also show you how to use background images and how to set, actually no, just background images. So that's it for now. As always, if you have any questions about this, let me know. And if you have any feedback as to how I could make this better, please let me know.